Somehow, when the wave of the new trade industries started booming in Philadelphia, the Negroes were excluded. When the trade jobs began popping up out of nowhere, like ads on a video, the Negro was nowhere to be found. Now, how did this happen? Who did it, and why did they do it? We're going to find out as we continue our studies on the Philadelphia Negro by Dr. W.E.B. Du Bois. Come on with it. The practical exclusion of the Negro from the trades and industries of a great city like Philadelphia is a situation by no means easy to explain. It is often said simply, the foreigners and trades unions have crowded Negroes out on account of race prejudice and left employers and philanthropists helpless in the matter. It is often said that the only reason Negroes can't get into certain trades and industries was because they were black, and most people didn't want to work with that race of people, and that the employers and the philanthropists couldn't do anything about that. This is not strictly true. This is not all the way true. There is truth in it, which he's not denying, but it is not the complete truth. Here's what he sees as the missing parts in the story. What the trades unions and white workmen have done is to seize an economic advantage plainly offered them. White workers saw a wide open economic opportunity, and they took full advantage of it. This opportunity arose from three causes. Here was a mass of black workmen of whom very few were by previous training fitted to become the mechanics and artisans of a new industrial development. Most of the blacks didn't possess the skills to enter into the new industrial economy. Here, too, were an increasing mass of foreigners and Native Americans who were unusually well fitted to take part in the new industries. The European foreigners and Native Americans, meaning white Americans, did possess the skills required for the new industrial economy. Finally, most people were willing and many eager that Negroes should be kept as menial servants rather than develop into industrial factors. Then the final piece was the European foreigners and white Americans using the tool of race to exclude Negroes from entering into the new industrial economy. This was the only piece that some people presented as the only reason Negroes weren't in the trades, as Dr. Du Bois mentioned earlier. But now we see more pieces of the puzzle to get a broader understanding. So again, the European immigrants and white Americans seized on a wide open opportunity laid in front of them through the cosmic workings. A new industrial industry so happened to emerge at the time when most Negroes lacked the skills to participate in it. But many of the whites and European immigrants already had the skills, so they were able to jump right into it. And when they lifted up their eyes and realized the opportunity that they had stumbled into, that's when they decided to use the idea of race as a tool to keep blacks as servants and prevent them from entering into this portion of the economy. Do you see that? Now let's continue. This was the situation, and here was the opportunity for the white workmen. They were by previous training better workmen on the average than Negroes. Some of the whites had generations of training in skilled trades and crafts. The European immigrants especially were trained for generations in carpentry, masonry, metalwork, ironwork, etc., passed down from father to son or learned through apprenticeships. The Negroes, on the other hand, were mostly from the country, where they were trained for generations and were highly skilled in agriculture and domestic service. But those skills didn't match the needs of the new booming economy. The white Americans and the European immigrants had the skills that did, and they were, by previous training, better workmen on the average than Negroes. They were stronger numerically, and the result was that every new industrial enterprise started in the city took white workmen. Soon the white workmen were strong enough to go a step further than this and practically prohibit Negroes from entering trades under any circumstances. Soon the whites could cooperate together and say, we don't want the black race to enter into the trade, no matter what. And one of the powers behind the idea of race is that it bases everything on surface-level physical features. And since those are fixed and unchangeable for the most part, it leaves no room to consider anything else. So when the white Americans and European foreigners said no Negroes whatsoever, That's saying that you could be the most skilled Negro on the planet, but because you belong to the black race, you're still not allowed in. And that's how race has always been used ever since it was invented by the Europeans in the colonial period. It's to indicate who should be dominated and discriminated against, all non-whites, but mostly those labeled as blacks. And it indicates who is to do the dominating and discriminating, which are those labeled as whites. Right? And that has largely been the extent of the idea of race. Because the way humans operate is that there's something innate within us that makes us feel the need to dominate and control things, whether it's the environment, animals, or other humans. So, throughout history, humans have created various ways to express this internal trait by discriminating based on things like family background, religion, class, economic status, gender, nationality, and others. And all of these have been used as tools by humans to say people who come from such and such background, religion, class, gender, should be held at the bottom. The Europeans came along during their age of colonial domination, and they added to the list of ways to discriminate and dominate people. They figured out that it was extremely effective for them to do it based on physical features. So they came up with this idea of race, and they started organizing people into these categories to rearrange the world in such a way that made sense to them and was useful for their agenda, which was domination. So what we're seeing here with the whites is the whites doing what many of them have always done, and that's using race to keep those labeled as blacks in a fixed position at the bottom of the pit. This affected not only new enterprises, but also old trades like carpentering, masonry, plastering, and the like, which some blacks had been previously skilled in. Race was used as a tool to block them off. So not only were Negroes blocked off from the new industries, they were also blocked off from the old ones by the white Americans and European immigrants. They immediately combined against Negroes primarily to raise wages. The standard of living of the Negroes lets them accept low wages, and, conversely, long necessity of accepting the meager wages offered have made a low standard of living. Negroes would work for lower wages because they had been accustomed to a low standard of living. So here's where the strategy comes in. The whites and European immigrants understood that Negroes would lower the wages if they entered into the trades. And because they weren't in the business of accepting low wages like the Negroes were, they combined together to make sure that Negroes weren't allowed in. As a result, they could keep the employees paying wages at what they deemed reasonable for their work. You see that? So they saw discrimination as necessary from their point of view if they didn't want to work for crumbs. And one way to ensure that they didn't do that was to use discrimination based on race, which could be said to be an appropriate strategy to achieve the objective they set out to achieve. Whether we look at it as moral or immoral, that doesn't matter. Either way, it worked. Thus, partially by taking advantage of race prejudice, partially by greater economic efficiency, and partially by the endeavor to maintain and raise wages, white workmen have not only monopolized the new industrial opportunities of an age, which has transformed Philadelphia from a colonial town to a world city, but have also been enabled to take from the Negro workman the opportunities he already enjoyed in certain lines of work. Through race prejudice, better skilled and organized people, and a desire to keep wages at a certain level, the white Americans and European immigrants took over the new industrial opportunities. Not only were they primarily the ones who built the factories, the railroads, the commercial buildings, paved the streets, installed the electrical poles, built the bridges, the work that helped transform Philadelphia from a colonial town to a world city, but they also made sure they snatched up any remaining skilled jobs where Negroes had a presence. You see? Now, what Dr. Du Bois goes on to talk about is how discrimination was hurting the society as a whole and how no special effort went into training the Negro boys. And as the older generation began to drop off from the trades, The younger generation was not compelled to take them up since they understood that they had a low chance of success, right? He also talks about how in the 1890s, or in 1890 specifically, Negroes were 4% of the population, but only 1.1% of the principal trades went to Negroes. And of these, they were mostly confined to barbers, dressmakers, cigar makers, and shoemakers, which the European immigrants and white Americans were closing in on as well, right? So for the Negro, it was wild out there in Philadelphia, as we can see. How now has this exclusion been maintained? In some cases by the actual inclusion of the word white among qualifications for entrance into certain trade unions. Here we go. Using race to include and exclude. Whites come on in and everyone else, especially those labeled as blacks, stay out. They were this blatant in some cases. More often, however, by leaving the matter of color entirely to local bodies who make no general rule but invariably fail to admit a colored applicant except under pressing circumstances. Most places weren't as upfront with their discrimination policy, but somehow they failed to hire colored people unless they were in desperate need of them. This is the most workable system and is adopted by nearly all trade unions. In sections where Negro labor in certain trades is competent and considerable, the trades union welcomes them, as in western Pennsylvania among miners and iron workers, and in Philadelphia among cigar makers. These were the areas where Negroes were already skilled, and there were enough of them. They were welcomed by trade unions in this instance. But whenever there is a trade where good Negro workmen are comparatively scarce, each union steadfastly refuses to admit Negroes, and relies on color prejudice to keep up the barrier. If there were only a few of them, no matter how skilled and willing to work they were, the whites and European immigrants barred the door by using race as the tool to do so. Do we understand? Thus the carpenters, masons, painters, ironworkers, etc. have succeeded in keeping out nearly all Negro workmen by simply declining to work with non-union men and refusing to let colored men join the union. That's how it went in the age of white supremacy. And it was unmistakably clear. To repeat then, the real motives back of this exclusion are plain. A large part is simple race prejudice, always strong in working classes, and intensified by the peculiar history of the Negro in this country. We started with this in the beginning, as this being part of the truth but not the truth in its entirety. Racial prejudice, which was and has always been expressed most fiercely in the white laboring class, or who we've known in other commentaries as the poor whites, was part of the motive. Another part, however, and possibly a more potent part, is the natural spirit of monopoly and the desire to keep up wages. Remember, he said Negroes had low standards of living, and because of that, they would work for low wages. The whites and European immigrants understood that, so they combined together to keep Negroes out in order to keep the wages reasonable for them. So today, the workmen plainly see that a large amount of competition can be shut off by taking advantage of public opinion and drawing the color line. Moreover, in this there is one thoroughly justifiable consideration that plays a great part, namely, the Negroes are used to low wages, can live on them, and consequently would fight less fiercely than most whites against reduction. You see that? Now watch this. The Negroes of the city who have trades either give them up and hire out as waiters or laborers, or they become job workmen and floating hands, catching a bit of carpentering here, or a little brickwork or plastering there, at reduced wages. Undoubtedly much blame can rightly be laid at the door of Negroes for submitting rather tamely to this organized opposition. Dr. Du Bois isn't doing what many of today's writers would do, which is only blame whites and portray blacks as being these helpless victims who hold no responsibility whatsoever. He states that Negroes needed to be blamed too, because as a whole they just laid down tamely to the organized and strategically thinking opposition. If they would meet organization with organization and excellence of work by excellence, they could do much to win standing in the industries of the cities. Unity with the right people is one of the most powerful weapons for anyone, especially for those at the bottom. When a bunch of people with little resources are able to organize and unite, all of a sudden those little resources combine to make something big. right? But this only works with people in their right mind. This is one area that Negroes as a group have always struggled with. So Dr. Du Bois is stating that if they were just able to organize themselves and match the others skill for skill, then they would have been a major force against the opposition. Those little individuals would have combined to make one collective being. You see, this is today hard to begin, but it is worth the trying, and the industrial department of the Institute for Colored Youth, which the Negroes themselves helped equip, is a step in this direction, and many more steps in that direction were needed, especially going against a system and people who were much more organized, had more resources, and were actively targeting them. Organization was really one of their biggest weapons, but they didn't fully understand how to activate it for the right purpose. But sometimes that's just how it went, right? In those old school rugged societies they lived in. So again, we see how Negroes were strategically blocked off out of the trades. The cosmic hand was on the side of the European foreigners and white Americans in this instance. The new industries were booming in Philadelphia, and they were already skilled to fill those positions when the Negroes weren't. Then they organized to strategically use race as the barrier of entry for learning and entering these new professions. Do you understand the chess strategy? Hopefully so. So from here, what we're going to do is we're going to pick up in the next commentary. I hope that you've gained something valuable out of this video. Right now, I thank you for your time and your attention. My name is Brooklyn St. Michael, and I'll see you in the free world.